Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Mike Fleischer, owner and co-founder of Collection Protection Resource. This short webinar was created for one purpose: to show you how consumers with overwhelming debt can eliminate the majority of that debt and restore their creditworthiness using federal consumer protection law. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you something that most consumers are never taught. How many people believe there are only three ways to deal with serious debt? Bankruptcy, debt consolidation, or some type of settlement program. That's what most people are told. But these options often come with serious long-term consequences. Bankruptcy can stay on your credit report for years, consolidation frequently does not reduce your total debt, and many settlement programs lock people into multi-year contracts with heavy fees. What most consumers don't realize is that there is another side of the debt system. A side that involves federal consumer protection law and the legal responsibilities that collectors must follow. When you understand that system and how to use those laws correctly, the balance of power between the consumer and the collector can change dramatically. That's exactly what we'll be discussing today. Now, before we go any further, I want to make a quick clarification. This presentation is for educational purposes only. Every financial situation is different and results can vary depending on the specific accounts involved. Many of our clients experience significant reductions in their debt burden, often in the range of 75% or more. But determining what is possible in your situation requires a personal consultation where we can review your accounts and documentation. The purpose of today's training is simply to show you something most consumers never learn about the debt collection system and your legal rights inside that system. Once you understand how the system actually works, everything begins to make a lot more sense. Now, let me start with a quick question. Have you ever felt like you're working harder and harder, but financially you're still standing in the same place? Your income may have increased, you may be working longer hours, but somehow the debt just doesn't seem to move. Month after month, the payments go out, and yet the balances barely change. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Millions of Americans feel like they're walking in place financially. And for many people, debt creates exactly that experience. You work harder, but the system keeps you stuck. Today, we're going to talk about why that happens and, more importantly, what most consumers have never been shown about escaping it. Let me ask you this. Does any of this sound familiar? Credit cards that slowly became maxed out over time, personal loans that seemed manageable at first, but now the balances just keep piling up, collection calls starting to increase, and maybe the most frustrating part of all, watching your credit score slowly decline even though you're doing your best to keep up. If you're experiencing any of these things, I want you to understand something important. You're not alone. Millions of consumers across this country are dealing with the exact same pressures, and the reason is not always what people think. In many cases, the problem isn't the consumer. It's the system itself. This training was created specifically for people dealing with situations like these. Consumers facing credit card debt that has grown beyond what they expected. People dealing with personal loans or medical debt that suddenly became overwhelming. Business owners who may have taken on liabilities during economic periods. And individuals who are now facing collection pressures and declining credit scores. If that describes your situation, then the information you're about to learn may help you understand something most consumers are never taught about how the debt collection system actually works. Now, over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 4 things that can completely change the way you look at debt. First, why many traditional debt solutions often fail consumers. Second, how the debt collection industry actually works behind the scenes. Third, what federal consumer protection laws say about your rights when dealing with collectors. And finally, a strategy that can help many consumers dramatically reduce their debt burden while rebuilding their credit worthiness. By the end of this presentation, you will understand something most people never learn about the debt system. And that understanding is exactly what prepares you for the next step, your debt elimination consultation, where we can review your specific situation and determine what options may be available to you. Now, a little bit about myself. Before we get any further, let me briefly tell you why this topic became so important to me. My name is Dr. Mike Fleischer, as you already know. I'm the owner and co-founder of the Collection Protection Resource. Before entering this field, or this niche as it were, I was practicing as a professional chiropractor for well over 40 years. But like many professionals during the 2008 financial crisis, I experienced a series of financial pressures that created a very difficult situation. At one point, the debt burden had grown so large that I started interviewing bankruptcy attorneys because I believed at that time that was the only realistic solution available. Bankruptcy, debt consolidation, or some type of settlement program. But as I started looking deeper into these options, something didn't feel right. And that's when things began to change for me. During that time, I met the individual who is now my business partner and lead paralegal. He had spent years studying consumer protection laws, debt elimination strategies, and credit restoration processes. What he showed me completely changed the way I understood the debt system. You see, most consumers believe that once a debt reaches collections, they have little control. But that belief usually exists because consumers have never been taught their legal rights. Even more importantly, most consumers do not understand the structural weaknesses inside the debt collection system itself. And once you begin to understand those weaknesses, the entire situation begins to look very different. Now, to really understand how this works, we first need to understand how banks actually operate. Banks do not operate emotionally, obviously. They operate mathematically. When you apply for a credit card, a loan, a line of credit, no one shows up at your house with a suitcase full of cash, gold bullion, or silver bars. Instead, the bank approves you electronically and places your name and the amount of credit you were given onto a digital ledger. From that moment forward, you essentially became a name and a number on a balance sheet. Banks are not concerned with personal stories or personal circumstances, life events, or financial hardships. Their system is designed around one primary objective: collecting interest and maintaining profitable accounts. But something very important happens when payments stop, and that is where the system begins to change. Before we go deeper into the mechanics of the system, it's important to recognize something that often gets overlooked. Debt is not just a financial issue. Debt becomes an emotional burden. It creates stress and frustration that follows people throughout their day. It creates anxiety when the phone rings. It creates pressure inside of families and relationships. And over time, it can slowly erode a person's financial confidence. Many people begin to feel embarrassed or ashamed about their situation. But the reality is that millions of people experience this exact same pressure. And once you understand how the system actually works, you begin to realize that the situation is often far more mechanical than personal. Now let's talk about what actually happens inside the banking system when payments stop. The sequence is extremely predictable. First, the phone calls begin. The bank attempts to encourage you to bring the account to current. If payments still don't occur, your credit scores begin to suffer. At the same time, the bank continues adding late fees and interest charges, which makes the balance grow even further. Eventually, usually somewhere between 120 and 180 days, the bank will declare the account a charge-off. A charge-off simply means the bank removes the debt from its active books as a performing asset. And this is where something extremely important happens. The debt is usually sold to a debt buyer for pennies on the dollar. Now let's talk about something most consumers never realize. The debt collection industry is an enormous business, worth tens of billions of dollars every year. When a bank charges off a debt, the debt is often sold to a debt buyer for pennies on the dollar. For example, a debt buyer may purchase a $10,000 account for only a few $100s. From that moment forward, the collector's goal is simple. They attempt to collect the entire balance from the consumer. If they succeed in collecting even a small portion of that balance, the return on their investment can be enormous. This is why collectors apply so much pressure through letters, phone calls, and legal threats. But there is something extremely important most consumers do not realize about this process. And that realization is where the balance of power begins to shift. Now, this slide illustrates the full life cycle of a typical consumer debt account. It begins when someone opens a credit card or takes out a personal loan. At some point, the consumer may fall behind on payments. The original creditor will attempt to collect internally. If those efforts fail, the account is charged off. After that, the debt is often sold to junk debt buyer, sometimes for just a few cents on the dollar. The debt buyer then assigns the account to a collection agency. And this is when the letters begin. The phone calls begin, the pressure begins. At that moment, most consumers believe they have only one choice. They believe they must pay the collector immediately, often out of fear. But there is another path. Consumers can challenge the debt legally, using their rights under federal law. And that is exactly where the strategy we use begins to change the situation. At this point, most consumers begin searching for solutions. And almost everywhere they look, they are presented with the same three options. We mentioned them before: bankruptcy, debt consolidation, or debt settlement or debt resolution programs. These three options dominate the marketplace, and many people assume they are the only choices available. But once you look more closely at how these solutions actually work, you begin to understand why so many consumers remain financially stuck even after entering those programs. So let's take a quick look at each one of them. Bankruptcy is often presented as a solution when debt becomes overwhelming, but bankruptcy comes with very strong or serious long-term consequences. A bankruptcy filing can remain on your credit report for 7 to 10 years. During that time, many people experience financial restrictions that affect housing, lending, and other opportunities. In addition, bankruptcy places your financial life under court supervision, and many people are required to enter long repayment plans. For those reasons, bankruptcy is generally considered a last resort option, should only be considered as a last resort, rather than a strategic financial solution. Another solution many consumers encounter is debt consolidation. At first glance, consolidation can sound attractive. All of your accounts are bundled into a single monthly payment, which may feel simpler to manage. But there are several important issues many people are not told about. First, consolidation usually does not reduce the total debt balance. Second, consolidation companies often charge substantial fees for managing the program. But perhaps the most important issue is this. When you enter many consolidation programs, you effectively forfeit your ability to negotiate directly with the individual creditor or debt collector. And giving up that negotiation ability can remove one of the most powerful tools available to consumers. Debt settlement companies present another option that many consumers explore. These programs often involve signing contracts that can last 4 to 5 years, and during that time, the consumer makes monthly payments into an escrow account. The settlement company then deducts its service fees, which can sometimes exceed 25% of the enrolled debt, or more. But here's the important question many people never ask. If a settlement company collects fees every month over several years, do they really have a strong incentive to resolve the debt quickly? In many cases, the process simply stretches out for years while fees continue to accumulate. So now we arrive at something that most consumers are never taught about the debt collection system. When a debt is sold from the original creditor to a debt buyer, that transaction creates what is known as a chain of assignment. In simple terms, that means there should be a documented history showing exactly who owned the account at each stage of the transfer. But in many situations, the documentation associated with that transfer is incomplete or inconsistent. Let me say that one more time. But in most situations, the documentation associated with that transfer is incomplete or inconsistent. That's important because under federal consumer protection law, a collector must be able to validate the debt they claim you owe. That means they must demonstrate that the debt exists, that they have the legal authority to collect it, and that the documentation supports their claim. In many cases, when consumers properly exercise their legal rights, collectors struggle to provide that validation. And this is where the balance of power begins to change. Now, this is where federal law begins to play a very important role. There are two primary laws that protect consumers when dealing with debt collectors and credit reporting agencies. The first is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, often referred to as the FDCPA. This law governs how debt collectors are allowed to communicate with consumers and what they must prove when attempting to collect debt. The second is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA. This law governs the accuracy and reporting requirements associated with credit reporting agencies and the creditors who furnish information to those agencies. Together, these laws create a framework designed to protect consumers from abusive collection practices and inaccurate reporting. Unfortunately, most consumers are never taught how these laws actually work or how they can be used effectively. But once you understand them, the balance of power in the collection process can begin to change. Many people ask an important question at this point. Why do collectors push so aggressively? The simple answer is because they can. Debt collectors understand that most consumers are unfamiliar with the legal protections that exist, and larger accounts can generate significant commissions for collection agencies and their representatives. These larger accounts are considered actionable, and those collections agencies are licking their chops, hoping they can fool you, essentially, into paying them significant sums of money on the debt. Because of that, many collection strategies rely on what's called predictable psychological pattern. First comes fear, letters that look intimidating, phone calls that suggest urgency, then comes confusion. Consumers are unsure what their rights are or what they are supposed to do. That confusion often leads to consumer ignorance of the legal process. And when that happens, the collector wins by default. But when a consumer understands their rights and begins responding strategically, the situation then changes dramatically. This is where one of the most important consumer rights comes into play. It's called debt validation. Under federal law, when a collector attempts to collect a debt, they must be able to demonstrate several things. First, they must show that the debt actually exists. Second, they must demonstrate that they have the legal authority to collect that debt. And third, they must provide documentation that establishes the full chain of ownership from the original creditor to the current entity attempting to collect. In many cases, especially when debts have been bought and sold multiple times, which often is the case, that documentation can be incomplete or difficult for collectors to produce. And when the collectors are required to validate that debt properly, many collection efforts begin to weaken. This is where knowledgeable consumers can begin to shift the balance of power in their favor. Now you begin to negotiate on your terms and not the debt collector's terms. Now, at this point, it becomes helpful to compare the traditional path most consumers experience with a more strategic approach. The traditional path looks like this. A consumer falls behind on payments. The account is eventually charged off. The debt is sold to a debt buyer. The debt buyer assigns the account to a collection agency. And the consumer experiences ongoing collection pressure and harassment. That process can continue for years without any resolution. Now, compare that with a different approach. Instead of reacting to collectors, the consumer places collection protection around themselves first. Then the debt is challenged through proper validation procedures. This shifts the balance of power. The collector is now the party being challenged, and the consumer regains negotiation leverage. The end result is not harassment. The end result is control, negotiation power, and ultimately peace of mind. This slide represents the true turning point in the process. The moment collectors must actually prove their claims, the balance of power begins to shift. Instead of responding emotionally to collector or collection pressure, the consumer now operates from a position of knowledge and legal leverage. At that point, the consumer is no longer negotiating on the collector's terms. They are negotiating on their own terms. Collection harassment typically begins to slow down or stop completely, and the situation moves toward fair resolution instead of intimidation. At the same time, steps can begin toward credit restoration, allowing the consumer to rebuild financial stability moving forward. This is where our process comes into play. At Collection Protection Resource, we use what we call the Collection Protection Shield. This method focuses on several coordinated steps designed to protect the consumer and restore financial leverage. First, we help consumers understand how to protect their assets and equity rather than giving those assets away under collection pressure. Second, we work to eliminate the harassment that often comes from aggressive collection tactics. And third, our legal response strategies shift the balance of power so that the consumer is negotiating from a position of strength rather than fear. And finally, we begin addressing the credit reporting side of the situation using the protections provided by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This allows many consumers not only to address their debt situation, but also begin rebuilding their credit profile moving forward. One of the most encouraging parts of this process involves credit restoration. Many consumers believe that once their credit has been damaged, it may take many years to rebuild. But federal law also provides protections in this area through the Fair Credit Reporting Act. When reporting errors or unsupported derogatory entries appear on a credit report, consumers have the right to challenge those entries. And when credit reporting laws are properly enforced, inaccurate or unsupported items can often be corrected or removed. The result can be significant improvement in a consumer's credit score and overall credit worthiness. This means the process is not only about addressing the debt situation, it's also about rebuilding financial opportunity moving forward. Your life begins anew. The purpose of this webinar was to help you understand something most consumers are never taught about the debt system. But every financial situation is unique, and that's why the next step is a debt elimination consultation. During that consultation, we will review the details of your specific situation, we will answer your questions, and we will explain the precise method that may be used to reduce your debt burden. You also receive a clear roadmap and structured time frame so you understand what the process may look like moving forward. The goal of that consultation is simple: to give you clarity and direction. If there is one message I want you to take away from this presentation, it is this: relief is possible, clarity is possible, substantial debt reduction is possible, credit restoration is possible, and a financial reset is absolutely possible. The most important step is simply taking action and learning what your options really are. I encourage you to schedule your consultation and come prepared with your questions so we can review your situation together, and I look forward to speaking with each of you personally.